Hey everyone, today we're diving into an incredible story, the story of Daniel. Now, you might have heard about him from the Bible, or maybe you haven't, but trust me, this is one of those stories that sticks with you. So, who was Daniel? Well, according to the Bible, Daniel was this young guy from Jerusalem, a noble Jewish kid, who got captured by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Imagine that, being taken away from your home to serve the very people who invaded your country. But here's the thing, Daniel didn't just survive, he thrived. He became a trusted advisor to the king, and not just one king. He served many rulers all the way through until the Persian conqueror Cyrus took over. Now, here's the wild part. Throughout his life, Daniel stayed true to his faith in the God of Israel, even though he was surrounded by people who didn't believe the same. And that's not all. His loyalty, his wisdom, and his ability to interpret dreams made him a standout figure. Some scholars think Daniel was a real person who lived during the 6th century BCE, but others argue that his story is more symbolic, written to reflect events from the 2nd century BCE, especially during the reign of this king named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Either way, whether Daniel was real or more of a legendary figure, his story has inspired people for centuries. Now, fast forward to today, there are actually 6 cities that claim to have Daniel's tomb, with the most famous one located in Susa, southern Iran. That's how widespread his legend is. Though Daniel isn't officially considered a prophet in Judaism, the rabbis still saw him as a role model, someone who stuck to his principles, even when others tried to tear him down. And in Christianity, he is seen as a prophet, while in Islamic tradition, he's also recognized as a prophet, even though he doesn't appear in the Quran. What's fascinating is the meaning of Daniel's name. It literally translates to, God is my judge. And, even though the Daniel most people know is the one from the book of Daniel, who's famous for his visions and dream interpretations, there are actually a few other Daniels mentioned briefly in the Bible too. There's one in the book of Ezekiel, known for his wisdom, righteousness, and faith. In fact, Ezekiel even says that if Israel had people like Noah, Daniel, and Job, they'd only be able to save themselves through their righteousness. There's also a mention of a Daniel in the book of Ezra, who was a priest traveling with Ezra back to Jerusalem. And let's not forget about King David's son, who was also named Daniel. But the Daniel we're focusing on today is the one from the book of Daniel, the one who went through some serious tests of faith. The story kicks off with Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, being taken to Babylon. Now, these guys were smart and good-looking, so the king picked them to be trained for his royal court. They were even given new Babylonian names. Daniel was renamed Belteshazzar, and his friends got names like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But here's where things get interesting. Daniel and his friends refused to eat the rich food and wine from the king's table because they didn't want to go against their beliefs. And guess what? Because of their faith, God gave them wisdom and understanding, and they became wiser than all the other magicians and enchanters in the kingdom. Things take a turn when King Nebuchadnezzar has this crazy dream about a giant statue made of different metals. None of his wise men can explain it, but Daniel steps up. He tells the king that the statue represents 4 different kingdoms, with Babylon being the first. But eventually, all of them will fall, and God will establish his kingdom that will last forever. But that's not the only dream. Nebuchadnezzar has another one, this time about a massive tree that gives shelter to the whole world, only to be chopped down by a heavenly figure. Once again, Daniel interprets it, explaining that it's about how God controls the fate of kings and kingdoms. Now, fast forward to when Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belshazzar, is on the throne. During one of his wild feasts, he uses sacred vessels from the Jewish temple, and suddenly a mysterious hand appears and writes a message on the wall. Belshazzar freaks out, and of course, Daniel is the only one who can decipher it. The message tells Belshazzar that his kingdom will be taken over by the Medes and Persians because he disrespected God. And that's exactly what happens. Belshazzar is overthrown, and a new ruler, Darius the Mede, comes to power. Darius is so impressed with Daniel that he makes him one of the highest-ranking officials. But not everyone's happy about that. Daniel's jealous rivals plot against him, convincing the king to pass a law that basically bans worshiping anyone other than the king. But Daniel stays true to his faith, and for that, he's thrown into a den of lions. Here's the twist. An angel saves Daniel, and instead, his accusers end up getting destroyed. Daniel's faith keeps him safe, and he's restored to his position. Later in his life, Daniel starts having these intense visions of the future. One of the most famous visions involves 4 beasts rising from the sea, symbolizing different kingdoms, with the last beast being the worst of them all. But in the end, God steps in and gives power to one like a son of man. These visions are packed with symbolism and prophecies about the future, and while they're complex, they all point to one thing: God's ultimate plan for the world. And now, the Greek version of the book of Daniel has a few extra tales that aren't found in the Hebrew text. These additional stories give us more insight into Daniel's character and his adventures. First up, we have the story of Susanna. In this tale, Daniel steps in to save a young Jewish woman who's falsely accused by 2 corrupt Jewish elders. These elders try to force themselves on her, and when she refuses, they accuse her of being unfaithful to her husband, which was a crime punishable by death. But Daniel doesn't buy their lies. He cleverly cross-examines the elders and catches them in their deceit, exposing their evil plot. Instead of Susanna, the 2 elders end up facing the death penalty. What's interesting here is that the villains are Jewish, unlike the usual foreign enemies, and this story may have been a way to criticize certain Jewish leaders at the time, showing how power can be abused. Then, we've got Bel and the Dragon, a story split into 2 parts. In the first part, Daniel exposes the priests of the god Bel for being frauds. These priests had been tricking people into thinking their idol was eating the offerings left for it, but Daniel proves it's actually the priests themselves sneaking the food. In the second part, Daniel confronts a giant serpent that the king Cyrus believes is a god. Daniel takes the serpent down, which leads the Babylonians to rebel against Cyrus. As a result, Daniel is thrown into a lion's den again. But this time, the prophet Habakkuk miraculously brings him food, and eventually, Cyrus repents for imprisoning him. As for Daniel's death, there's quite a bit of mystery. According to Jewish tradition, he lived into the reign of King Ahasuerus, or Artaxerxes, but some sources claim he was killed by Haman, the villain from the Book of Esther. Josephus, a 1st century Jewish historian, wrote that Daniel's body was laid to rest in a tower alongside the kings of the Medes and Persians, while other sources say he was buried in Susa, where some even believed sacred objects from the Jewish temple were hidden near his tomb. Speaking of Daniel's tomb, it's a bit of a mystery too. No less than 6 different cities claim to have it. These include places in Iraq, Iran, and even Uzbekistan. But the most famous site is in Susa, southern Iran, where people still make pilgrimages to this day. Local tradition has it that there was a big dispute between the rich and the poor over who should get possession of Daniel's body, so they ended up hanging his coffin on a chain over a river to keep it fair. Now, in Jewish tradition, Daniel isn't technically considered a prophet because prophecy was thought to have ended with earlier figures like Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. However, Daniel's story was incredibly popular among the Jewish people, and the legends around him continued to grow. The rabbis from the first few centuries CE saw Daniel as the most righteous and pious member of the Jewish community in Babylon. They even wrote down various legends about him, one of which explains how he proved his purity to King Nebuchadnezzar by showing that he and his companions were eunuchs, free from the immoral behavior they had been wrongly accused of. Another tale says Daniel continually prayed for the welfare of Nebuchadnezzar. even when the king was cursed by God to live as a wild animal for a period. Daniel's prayers reportedly helped shorten the king's punishment. And when Nebuchadnezzar was on his deathbed, he wanted to leave part of his inheritance to Daniel. But Daniel refused, saying he couldn't accept it because of his Jewish heritage. There's also a story about how Daniel restored the sight of King Darius after the king realized he had wrongfully imprisoned Daniel. Darius was so moved by Daniel's piety that many people converted to Judaism after witnessing this miracle. In Christianity, Daniel holds a special place too. In the New Testament, Jesus refers to Daniel in Matthew 24:15 when he talks about the abomination of desolation. Daniel's prophecies are often seen as predicting the coming of Christ. For example, Daniel's vision of the stone smashing the idol is interpreted by many Orthodox Christians as symbolizing Jesus, born from the Virgin Mary, coming to establish God's eternal kingdom. Daniel is also celebrated in the Roman Catholic Church, where his feast day falls on July 21st. Various local churches may celebrate him on other days too. For example, in Gorizia, Italy, his feast is on September 11th. In Islam, while Daniel isn't mentioned by name in the Quran, Islamic literature holds him in high regard as a righteous man and a prophet. Some stories say he was rescued from the lion's den with the help of another prophet, Jeremiah, and that he interpreted the dream of a statue made of 4 metals. Muslim scholars like Abdullah Yusuf Ali describe Daniel as a noble figure who stayed true to Jerusalem, despite his high-ranking position in Babylon. Even when a law was passed forbidding prayer to anyone but the Persian king for 30 days, Daniel continued to pray 3 times a day facing Jerusalem, staying loyal to his faith. In Shia Islam, there's a hadith that quotes Imam Ali, praising Daniel as a wise and pious man, one beloved by God. He is viewed as a prophet and a source of wisdom, and many of the events described in the Bible are echoed in these Islamic accounts.